Hey everybody, and welcome to another Nintendo countdown list. This week's list is the top 10 OMG moments in video game history. And now, a little specification before I get into my top 10 list. I'm not just talking about in video games, like stuff that happens within video games, like a scene, a cut scene, a moment you didn't see coming. I'm also talking about video game history, like things that happened in the video game industry to kind of change it forever. Now, this is a top 10 list. So obviously there's going to be a lot of things left out. And this is also my top 10 list. So maybe your top 10 OMG moments are on this list. Maybe they're not. Maybe some of them. Maybe we share them. But, it's just kind of lists. They're subjective. Things like that. But we're going to start with a few honorable mentions because I was going through making the list. And I had several things on there. But I think I narrowed it down to a tight 10, but I did have some honorable mentions I wanted to get in there. First honorable mention that's up is Would You Kindly, and There's Always a Lighthouse from BioShock and BioShock Infinite games. Kind of like when you get that moment in BioShock and you realize you've been used the entire time by Atlas. It's just like, or Frank Fontaine, whichever you want to call him. You're just like, what the heck? And then you get to the end of BioShock Infinite, and Elizabeth shows you the infinite lighthouses, the infinite possibilities of the multiverse. After you see that somehow Infinite is connected to BioShock, even though they don't exist in the same universe, kind of thing like that. Just some really, really cool stuff within that game. So that was definitely, both of those were like OMG moments for me when I was playing those games, back in 2006, 2008, and then 2012 for BioShock Infinite. So really cool moments. Next up on our honorable mentions is pulling the Master Sword in Ocarina of Time. Just when you take it out, you hear the music, the swirling theatrics around you within the Temple of Time. Just really, really cool moment, especially for like me as a Zelda fan. 97, I think, is when that game came out. So I was 14, 15 years old, maybe 98. So just a cool moment in Zelda. I'd always been a big Zelda fan. A Link to the Past was always one of my favorite Zelda games. And so playing Ocarina in 3D, pulling the Master Sword in 3D was just fantastic. Next up we have is Remember, No Russian from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. I remember I remember playing that for the first time before the controversy really got out, because I used to really, really like COD for both the single player missions as well as playing online with friends and things like that. And I remember playing this before the controversy broke out. And I was like, what the heck is going on? And everyone just starts shooting people up in the airport. And, you play as the good guy. So I was like, I feel if I, do this, it will negatively affect the game. So I'm walking through, I don't shoot anybody. Because I'm just like, what the heck? And then, at the end of the mission, you get whacked. So it's just one of those moments in games where you're just like, wow. And then, of course, the big controversy started over it. Those people who trumpet that horn of video games promote violence and video game this, video game that, video games are bad for kids and such. Of course, this gave them opportunity, fuel for the fire against people who like to play video games and video games in general. So that was one of those moments, like, it's a really cool moment in game. You're just kind of like, man, now I know this is going to be on Fox News or something like that. So, yeah. Remember, No Russian. The Scarecrow from Batman Arkham games, especially Arkham Asylum, that whole nightmare sequence. You're playing, like, this action game. It's linear. You're walking down the halls, things like that. And all of a sudden, you're in a nightmare. Like, your dad wakes up talking to you. Bunch of freaky moments in that game. So, really cool, creepy moment for a game that's not creepy, a game that's an action game. It's not supposed to have any of those Resident Evil type of survival horror scares in them. And then, just kind of on the same thing, the sanity meter in Eternal Darkness. For those of us who played Eternal Darkness when it first came out on the GameCube, state-of-the-art graphics, so they look believable for the time. But just your system shutting down on you, your memory card corrupted, controls not working, the volume going out of control, just all these things happening to you while playing the game was, it's a part of the game, but things like the memory card corrupting, things like that We didn't expect that to happen, so we actually thought something happened within our game. So just the way the game messed with you and everything like that is just complete and utter insanity, and Nintendo holds the patent for that, and I don't know if that's expired yet. But man, what I would love for a game to do something in that vein. Right now I'm playing through Alan Wake 2, and I feel like that game already kind of messes with your head a little bit. I feel if that did something like the sanity meter, if Alan Wake 2 had that, that would just, man, that would put that game over the top. Like already Alan Wake 2, the deluxe edition is what I'm playing, so I'm playing through all the DLC too. It's already up for one of my games of the year this year for 2024. And if it had the sanity meter, it would probably be a lock for game of the year. And the last honorable mention, for those of us who grew up in the 90s, I think we can all agree on this one. And this one almost made the top 10 list. It just barely got bounced. But stepping out onto the Halo in Halo Combat Evolved for the first time, it basically took, Halo basically took what GoldenEye 007 did, Rare did on the N64 for console shooters, and just doubled down, and just, that was the shooter back in the day. Like, I know Halo's kind of fallen from grace a little bit, and I don't believe the hype with a lot of people. I still think Halo Infinite is a good game. I had fun with the story, the single player story, and then I also had a lot of fun playing multiplayer. So Halo is not a bad game by any stretch of the means, but that first Halo game, that was something really special. It's something us console players really hadn't experienced before, and it was just amazing. And I can't say enough good things about it. And so yeah, so those are the honorable mentions right there. And now let's get into the countdown proper. All right, coming in at number 10, we have a real life scenario, not an in-video game scenario, but EA securing the exclusive rights to the NFL license for its Madden franchises. I know a lot of you young viewers out there, all you know is Madden when it comes to NFL games. You're playing an NFL game, it's Madden. That's all there is. And I'm sure you've heard us old people talk about the glorious of the NFL 2K series. I know I've done a few video games about the Dreamcast, and I talk very highly of that series. But also, what was kind of great before Madden swallowed up the NFL license was just all the wild west of NFL football games out there. Like the Nintendo made their own NFL game. There was Tecmo Bowl. There was just so many football games out there with the NFL license. And they were all called like NFL football. There was no John Elway had his own football game. There was John Elway football on the Nintendo, but very few of them actually had a name. It was just NFL football or football kind of thing. And then in the Super Nintendo Genesis eras, we had Joe Montana football. We had Madden. We still had Tecmo Bowl. It was just more and more games. And then when we get to the 3D generation, Xbox had NFL Fever, 989 Studios for Sony. Nintendo didn't have their own NFL game. They just had Madden, and then Acclaim had Quarterback Club. And I know I'm leaving some, and I mean 2K with Sega when we got to the Dreamcast. And I know I'm probably leaving out some other franchise. Oh, NFL Blitz. So, I mean, there was a bunch of NFL games out there not made by EA, which I'm always a big competition kind of person. And the Madden games, like, I don't want to sound like one of those people back in my day, but the Madden games back in the early 2000s were definitely, late 90s, early 2000s, were definitely better games. And it's because they had to compete. They couldn't just put the same game out every year. They had to actually innovate and do new things. So, I mean, not everything stuck. Like, I remember the quarterback cone. Like, you'd run around with your quarterback, and then the right thumbstick, you'd have to direct his head to, like, and if you threw within that cone, the pass was more accurate. Cool, like a cool idea, but it was a pain in the ass to do, especially if you're scrambling with someone like Mike Vick or Cordell Stewart. It's just like trying to run around and then focus your head. Not quite as easy as in real life, where I can run that way and still look down the field. Where if you're trying to run this way with the thumbstick, you're trying to do this other thumbstick, your thumbs don't want to work in that kind of manner. But, you know, they did try new things. We had different presentation. Same with NFL 2K. Like, before they went extinct, they had the ESPN license. So playing NFL 2K5 felt like you were, you know, watching an ESPN broadcast, because you even had Chris Berman doing NFL primetime. It was really great. So EA securing that NFL license really did it not only affected NFL sports games, but it also had a negative effect on all the other leagues, because then 2K went out and they got the license for the NBA games. I mean, EA kind of had some games for a while, but 2K secured it. But also 2K secured the license for baseball games on multi-platforms. So Sony, like, because they still have the show, Sony could make their baseball game, but it only exclusive to Sony. And if Microsoft wanted to, Nintendo could also, they could make a game strictly for their system. But to put a game out on multiple systems, multiple consoles, it could only go through 2K games. So EA was locked out of the baseball games, which the irony of that is I always felt the EA baseball games were better than the 2K baseball games, and the 2K football games were better than Madden. So, yeah, that did have an effect on the league. And now, EA is our only place for Madden and hockey, because 2K doesn't make hockey games anymore. I don't know if EA has the NHL license locked down or if just 2K gave up. But then, MLB games are only with the show. So we only have one option to play baseball, one option to play football. Like I said, I'm not sure if 2K locked down the NBA license or if they just pummeled EA into submission with basketball, but 2K is our only place to go for basketball. I really do miss those Wild West days of every publisher having their own sports games. It made for a huge variety and also just a lot of competition out there. I mean, Madden and 2K were the two big ones for football, but still you had other choices, so they both really had to try hard for your dollars. And now we don't do that anymore. No sports league, no American sports league, I should say, is made by multiple publishers. They're all either EA or 2K, and that's kind of sad nowadays. All right, coming in at number 9, Chrono dying in the middle of Chrono Trigger. This was one of those big shocks for us gamers back in the day. It's because you're playing as Chrono. The game's called Chrono Trigger. He's the hero. He's supposed to live throughout the game. And I want to say you're 3/4 of the way through the game, and Chrono sacrifices himself for the betterment of the party. And it's just like, whoa, what the heck? What are we going to do now? And then you do spend a chunk of the game trying to get Chrono back, because the game does involve time travel. So, there are those things to do it to, bring him back. And that's what the game did. You eventually get him back. But at that time, I remember playing that for the first time. I was like, what the heck? Because my buddy had already beaten it. He gave me his copy of Chrono Trigger, which it's my weekly lament on my copy of Chrono Trigger going missing when I moved. I pray that it's in a box that I haven't unpacked yet, but it's been 2 years now. Pretty sure I looked through in every box. But yeah, my childhood copy that my buddy gave me, I remember when that moment happened. And the next day at school, I found Jason. I was like, dude, Chrono died? What the heck? And he just had this smirk on his face like, oh, I know something you don't kind of thing. But yeah, I was just like, what the heck? And then, like I said, you do eventually get him back. And, you save the day. You beat Lavos and everything like that. So coming in at number 8, we have Nintendo embarrasses Sony and goes with Panasonic over Sony for their CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. Now, this was kind of a shocker because I remember when the Sega CD came out, and these are like the schoolyard rumors, like, oh, Sega's got a CD add-on. Nintendo's going to have an add-on for the Super Nintendo. And it was one of those things where I don't know if any of us had any basis, like if anybody actually read it anywhere, because this was pre-internet days. But we were all talking about it and like willing it into existence. And then I remember seeing either like a GamePro or an EGM where they showed the Nintendo, Sony, PlayStation add-on to the Super Nintendo. And we were all hyped and excited for it. Of course, we weren't privy. I want to say this was the first E3. It was either the first E3 or it was the last CES that was big for video games and leading into the first E3. But yeah, so Sony, it was a done deal between Sony and Nintendo. Sony was going to do the add-on for the Super Nintendo, and they were going to get into the video game market with the Super Nintendo PlayStation. or the Sony Super Nintendo PlayStation, the Nintendo PlayStation. Can't remember exactly what that name was going to be. There are like prototypes out there to check out. You can just do a YouTube search to find them. But it was one of those kind of really cool, amazing things, and we were all excited for it. And then Nintendo got cold feet because Sony was, and you can't blame Nintendo for it because Sony was using Nintendo to get into the video game market, and they had a lot of control over the software and hardware in this deal with Nintendo. And then Nintendo kind of realized at the ninth hour that, oh man, if we go through with this deal, Sony not literally own them, but own them, kind of thing like that when it comes to video games. So Nintendo backed out and went with Panasonic, and we got that terrible Zelda and terrible Mario game on the Panasonic CDI. But it was one of those really embarrassing moments, and a lot of people look at that moment as, oh, this is what made Sony get into the video game market. But if you've read some books about that, especially Console Wars, you'll know that Sony was already working on the PlayStation, and in fact, Ken Kutaragi, who made the PlayStation, he didn't want to go with Nintendo or Sega or anybody. He wanted Sony to do their own thing, but Sony was very, very iffy on that because this was still the mid-90s, and video games were still really considered kids' things and toys and things like that, and Sony was a serious electronics company. They made TVs and headphones, and they had just bought Columbia TriStar Pictures, so they were making movies and things like that. So they didn't want to be in the toy business at all. They were in the electronics business. But the irony of that is the Sony PlayStation is the biggest profit for Sony as a brand these days. But Sony was so iffy about dipping their toes in there. So Sony, was kind of screwed over by Nintendo, but they already had a PlayStation ready to go. They were, some of the more higher ups wanted to partner with a Nintendo, with a Sega, so they wouldn't have all the risk involved. Because coming out with a new console, we saw with the Atari Jaguar, Philips CDI comes to mind, and just so many others after Nintendo, became the dominant force in the 80s with the Nintendo Entertainment System. So many consoles came along from various companies, successful companies, mind you, and just failed. Sega was the first one to put a dent in Nintendo's armor, where others were just failing left and right. So, Sony being a new platform, they had every right to be nervous about jumping into this video game market because pretty much everybody else who's gotten their ass kicked by Nintendo and or by Sega. So Sony's higher ups didn't want to take all the risks. They wanted to partner with somebody else. And then kind of, it's never been confirmed, but kind of hinted at that Sony, whoever they partnered with, they were going to backstab in the end and then go off on their own, which is kind of why Nintendo did what they did and went with Panasonic. I do wish, I don't believe in multiverses, kind of thing like that. That's kind of a weird concept, but I would love to take a peek at that reality where the Super Nintendo PlayStation or the Nintendo PlayStation, the Sony Nintendo PlayStation, was a real thing. I know I would have been begging my parents to let me buy it. And, I also kind of wonder with that if, we would have, if we would have gotten the N64 that I got going behind me, what would the video game world look like that had Nintendo gotten into the 32-bit market with CDs and not cartridges? How that landscape of video games would be vastly different. In fact, I dare say we might have Xbox, but it might just be it in 2024 had Nintendo and Sony partnered and stayed partnered. It might be just Nintendo versus Sega in the end. So, we got more competition and everything like that. So, all's well that ends well, I guess, except for Sega, which ended not too many years later with follies of their own. But yeah, that's what we got right there at number 8. Nintendo goes with Panasonic over Sony for their CD add-on. Coming in at number 7 is the zombie reveal in the original Resident Evil game. Now, we can all look back on that original PlayStation version of Resident Evil, Biohazard if you're in Japan, and we can look at the opening cinematics, not even cinematics, the opening movie, I guess, live action, and laugh at the cheesiness of it, because it was pretty cheesy, but you gotta think, again, this is the early 90s. The only people playing video games are kids and teens, So I was an early teen when Resident Evil came out, and that game was spooky as hell for us. So I know we're old; things are less scary now for you youngins. Uh, but yeah, that game was really creepy and spooky. I mean, it was the tone, it was the noises and things like that. Like, for all of its cheese and corniness, there is some creepy moments in the original Resident Evil, and maybe nothing creepier than when you come across that first zombie and it does that slow head turn and just looks back at you in full cinematics. And that is definitely an OMG moment, because even though you know you're playing a zombie video game, you're not ready at that point in time in video games and graphics. You were not ready for that visceral of a like realistic looking zombie to come at you, to turn its head and to look directly at you or at the camera. It was really creepy, and man, it was just like, that was one of those moments like, ho 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 ho, and you kind of pull back a little. And that's when video games, I think it was like that moment where video games really started to turn the corner from a kid's toy into something so much more, at least here in the States. I should emphasize that, because I know in Japan, video games had always been pretty popular among older people as well. A lot of people took off work to go buy video games. In fact, I think it was the launch of the Super Nintendo that caused the Japanese government to ask video game makers not to release stuff on a work day, because so many people called out of work to go get a Super Nintendo. So, but yeah, in the West here, I think that moment in video games is when video games went from a kid's toy to something that, 30 years later, I'm 41, I'm still playing video games. Plenty of adults playing video games, older teenagers, something like you were supposed to put away when you stopped being a kid. It just kept going, because you can still get those kid platformer type games, but we can get very mature games. And I'm gonna plug Alan Wake 2 again, because I'm loving the hell out of that game. That's so much fun. And without the Resident Evil on the PlayStation, we probably don't have a game like Alan Wake. So it all kind of goes back to that moment as far as gaming becoming more mature, and not in a Mortal Kombat more mature blood and guts everywhere, but a more mature, taking on more mature themes and adult oriented storylines, and not just kiddie save the princess platformer kind of stuff. Love you though, Mario. And now, coming in at number 6, we have another real world moment, and this is actually one of my favorite real world video game OMG moments. It's Sega's shadow drop of the Sega Saturn at E3, just saying, and it's available today. And then Sony, available today at $3.99, and then Sony's mic drop response when their conference started.
Steve Reyes, join me for a brief presentation. $2.99.
They just walked with the mic, $2.99, and walked off the stadium. It was one of those just double OMG moments. They could have been, separate entries, but because they're so connected, they got to be one. And it's always funny to me. I'll start with the Sega shadow drop. Now, had Sega planned this out, because basically the brief backstory to this is the Sega Saturn was selling really well in Japan, which is why I was able to. It's off camera, you can't see it because the way I have my camera anymore. Which is why I was able. The Sega Saturn was selling really well in Japan, and they had a whole year head start on the Sony PlayStation, which is, it's selling really well in Japan. Is why I have a Japanese Saturn, because I got that for $40 as opposed to paying like over $100 for a US one, because it didn't sell that well. But they had that lead, and they had that lead over Sony because they had that year head start, and the Saturn was selling really well. So the CEO of Sega of Japan went to the president of Sega of America the night before, or a couple nights before the E3 presentation, and basically said, hey, we've shipped some of these out to stores. We're shipping them out to stores now, and at E3, you're going to announce that it's available now. We need this head start over Sony because I believe the Saturn was supposed to launch in the fall, and then the following spring, I think, is when the PlayStation was supposed to launch. So, I mean, the Saturn was going to hit the market first, but Sega of Japan wanted a longer lead time to really saturate the market and then just hope people wouldn't buy a PlayStation, which was kind of happening in Japan. Sega of America, their president, he was not very keen on that. He was like, I don't really want to do that. That's a bad idea. You're not giving us enough stock. We're going to have to short some retailers, and some retailers might not even get any. We're going to lose relationships, so we're not going to be able to. They're not going to want to sell the Saturn when we do have more of a stock because they got screwed out of this initial rush. Because with anything in entertainment, your biggest bulk sales come at the beginning. So Sega of America was very concerned about this because they were just like, oh, this is a bad idea. This is a very, very bad idea. And looking back on it, everyone like poo-poos that. I like the moxie of Sega for doing that, just because if it was planned properly, like if it wasn't a spur of the moment decision, had they allocated stock to the stores and the stores were ready for it and everyone got, the orders they wanted and everything like that, to where no one was shorted, no one was offended or anything of that matter, I think it really would have worked. Because how cool would it be? Like, everyone is talking about the Nintendo Switch 2, and like I've said a couple times on this channel, we're so late in the year that Nintendo's not announcing anything before Christmas. But how cool would it be if Nintendo planned this out, if this was all a part of Nintendo's plan, and they stock all the stores, and let's say January 1st, okay, we're through the holidays, January 1st, we get a surprise Nintendo Direct, and they come on, Doug Bowser comes on and says, here's the Switch 2. And then at the very end of the Nintendo Direct, it's in stores now. And everyone just rushes out to the stores, post-holiday rush, things like that. If you plan that out, that would be awesome. That would be an awesome way to launch the system with a shadow drop like that. It's already in stores. They announce it. And all the pandemonium, the jingle all the way, Arnold Schwarzenegger versus Sinbad, we're rushing out to the stores to get ourselves a Switch 2. That would be cool. Had Sega done that, I really think it could have worked. I think that gamble actually really would have worked out if they, had planned it out in advance and they had allocated stock to other stores. Because what had happened was they didn't, and much like Sega of America's prediction, some stores just didn't want to carry the Saturn after that. They're like, well, you didn't give us any stock for this initial launch. No one's going to want it now because they've all gone to the bigger stores or what have you. So we're really not going to make a lot of space for the Saturn when it comes out, because we've got, the Sony PlayStation coming, and then Nintendo's got a new system coming. The Super Nintendo's still selling really well. Why would we, put store space for this when you didn't give us enough leeway, kind of thing like that. So that really hurt Sega because they didn't plan it. It was a spur of the moment thing. I mean, had they just moved up the launch date, then they might have been better off. But they didn't. And then of course, after the bungle of the launch and then the $399 price tag for Sony to launch their system come in and just $100 less if you just wait a little bit longer, I think really, really killed the Saturn in its tracks. Like, it just never got the traction here in the US. Granted, I played them both at like Macy's or Sears or whatever. I wanted a Saturn more than I wanted a PlayStation, but I mean, that would have been the wrong move. But it was one of those things. It was just a killer for Sega. And Sega wasn't dead yet. The Dreamcast, I still stand by the Dreamcast is a better video game machine than the PlayStation 2, but the PlayStation 2 had DVD, and that's where a lot of that 150 million have been sold, was with that as a DVD player. But that's a story for another time. But yeah, our number 6 moment is the Sega Saturn Shadow Drop and the Sony $299 response. All right, and coming in at number 5 from a lot of people's favorite Final Fantasy game. No, it's not that favorite one that a lot of people like. No. We're still in the 16-bit era. It is from Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy III here in the West. Kefka destroys the world in Final Fantasy VI. Now that was again much like Chrono Dine and Chrono Trigger. That was one of those. Wait, what? We're the heroes. We're supposed to save the world. The world's not supposed to go up in smoke and everything like that. And well, as the heroes, we failed, and Kefka won for a bit because the world did get destroyed, and it doesn't go back. Like, it's not one of those happy endings. Okay, we defeated the big bad. Now we can change everything back. No, the world of Final Fantasy VI is forever changed after Kefka destroys it. And again, it was one of those OMG, WTF moments in video games. Just things like that didn't happen in video games. Like, every once in a while in, some RPGs, like, there'd be downer moments, but never that big of a downer, kind of thing like that. So it was just one of those just gut punches, much like I said with Chrono Dine and Chrono Trigger. You just didn't see it happen. That's not how video games were. And I know I said not Final Fantasy, Resident Evil was kind of that shift into more mature gaming. Squaresoft laid the groundwork there with some of the storytelling they were doing in games like Chrono Trigger, games like Final Fantasy VI, where it wasn't these very simple good versus evil stories anymore. They were more complicated, more nuanced, and sometimes the heroes failed, and sometimes the good guys won, at least won for a little bit. So, really cool moment in the game. And again, it was one of those moments we didn't see coming. We just thought, we thought we were near the end of the game. We were going to beat Kefka, and then, holy crap, we're like maybe 60% of the way through, halfway through. We weren't even there yet. So it's just, oh man, it was just awesome. So yeah, that comes in at our number 5 moment. And number 4, now this one is, I think, the most recent thing on the list. And it is definitely a WTF moment. It was one of those things where nobody knew what was going on. Like, we didn't know what the heck this was. And it shocked the world. So some of you may remember 5 or 6 years ago, this mystery demo showed up on the PlayStation Store called PT. And a lot of people were playing it. It was just this weird, creepy game where you were just walking in the hallway. It was like a looping mechanic, and random spooky shit was happening, and you had to do things in a certain order in order to, quote-unquote, beat it. And when you did beat it, your character walks out onto the street, turns around, and oh my god, it's Norman Reedus. And then he walks on, and then just Silent Hills comes across the screen. Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro. And the internet just started freaking out over that. It was one of those just OMG, drop dead WTF moments in video gaming where everyone was going just crazy about it. And then, of course, all the drama with Kojima and Konami happened, and PT was pulled from the PlayStation Network. And I'm not sure what they're going for now, but I know a lot of people with PlayStation 3s, 4s? No, PlayStation 4s. With PT on it. Still the file's still on it. We're selling for like $600-$700. And it's a shame that Konami pulled that, because again, we've talked about game preservation on this channel about with ROMs and emulators and things like that. It's just kind of like the only way to play that is if you can find one of those PlayStations with the game already loaded on it, which is why I'm always tempted when I see a PS4 at like a thrift store or something like that cheap. I'm always tempted by, I was like, I wonder if this, because that would be really cool. That would be a cool find, kind of. But yeah, it's just game preservation. Like, Konami pulled that, and one, it was a cool experience, but also just what could have been. Now, I've never played a Silent Hills game. I've always thought they were cool, but the heyday of Silent Hill, I did not have a PlayStation or a PS2 because my PS2 had died, kind of thing. So I never, where I would go over to my buddy's house and we'd play Resident Evil, and then when 3 came out, I had a PS2 already, or they like Final Fantasy 9, Resident Evil 3, those kind of like came out at the very end of the PlayStation, and the PlayStation 2 was already coming out. So I played those, but I never went back for Silent Hill, and I want to say my PlayStation 2 crapped out on me. The laser died before the PlayStation 2 Silent Hill game came out. So I never actually got into Silent Hill. I've always been fascinated by it and like the lore. And this is going to sound dumb. I like the movies. But yeah, that was a game I never got into. But I was really intrigued for this because, A, I just love Kojima games. Norman Reedus was at the height of his powers then, and Guillermo del Toro is just an awesome, creepy director. So just those three coming together for a Silent Hill game just sounded great, especially because it felt like, I don't want to use the word reboot, but reimagine, just something new, a new take, kind of what Resident Evil 7, which I think was kind of inspired by PT, kind of did for the Resident Evil games, where it's just trying something new. It's like this version of survival horror that we've been doing is not resonating anymore. We need to do something different, and this was that something different. That was that shot in the arm the genre needed, and where we did not get Silent Hills from Kojima and Konami. Like I said, I want to say, just because we went the first person view and everything like that, it did inspire Resident Evil and then a bunch of other survival horror games to come out after that. So where we didn't get that game, we did get a lot of games inspired by it, and I think that kind of worked in the video game genre favor. But yeah, just PT just being this mysterious game that was really creepy, and then finally when people started beating it and posted videos on the internet, everyone just erupted. That was one of the very cool viral moments for video games on the internet. So that's why it's at our number 4 spot on this list. And coming in at our number 3 spot, we're almost there to the end, is that right behind me. That game right there. Just Super Mario 64 in general. This was the first, just not the first 3D platformer, but the first great 3D platformer. I remember, what was it, September 9th, I think was the release date for the N64, bringing this home from Toys R Us, popping this game in. I was on crutches at the time because I had torn my Achilles. Popping this game in, sitting down on the living room floor, and just in utter awe of this thing. It was just that right there, to start menu, or you're just playing around with Mario's face. It just blew my mind, because my buddy had a PlayStation when that came out, a year or year and a half before the N64, and I played that and played games like Twisted Metal and stuff like that, and those were a lot of fun. But even with kind of like the polygons and everything with the PlayStation and the better graphics of the 32-bit era going from the 16-bit era, nothing in that, at that point, had blown my mind. There was nothing about it that was like, yeah, this is just, the bee's knees kind of thing like that, revolutionary thing like that. And I'm sure if I'm wrong here, there'll be someone in the comment, well, Resident Evil was one of your OMG moments, the zombie, and that came out before Super Mario, which I'm not sure on the release dates there, but I hadn't played Resident Evil at that point yet. So if it had released before Mario 64, I hadn't played it yet, so it wasn't, an OMG moment. But as good as something like Resident Evil is, this was kind of like where gaming was going. I mean, it was a shame Nintendo did this shit on cartridges and not CDs, because the juggernaut the N64 could have been, if it was CDs and not cartridges, would have been phenomenal. But just the sheer just go anywhere, do anything kind of freedom it felt like you had in this game, we hadn't seen anything like that yet, especially in a platformer. And this game just felt so large when it really wasn't. The whole painting ideas and things like that was because of the limited space, but this game felt bigger than anything that had been released yet in home consoles. And just so many nostalgia hits when I fire up Super Mario 64. That's one of those games where every time it just, I'm transported back to being in 9th grade, 8th grade, I think 8th grade. We're going to go with 8th grade. I get transported back to that time and place as a kid. So it's just one of those, much like I was talking about with Halo in the honorable mentions, it's just something you hadn't experienced before, and you knew when playing it that this was a game changer. This was something new. This is where the industry was going now. And it's just, look at all the 3D platformers that have come after this. The ones before it were kind of janky and just didn't know what they were doing, but they showed you what to do with this. And because of that, we got, Sonic. We got more of the Sonic Adventure games. We got more Mario games. At the newest release from Sony, Astrobot, those all have their DNA with what Miyamoto and his R&D team did with Super Mario 64. So much like what Mario did for platformers in the 8-bit era going forward, this did for the 3D era going forward. So that was definitely an OMG moment when you first drop in that castle. I don't know a single person who wasn't talking about this game when it was released. It was just one of those game-changing games upon release, and that is why it's at our number 3 spot. Now, coming in at our number 2 moment, now we're at that infamous scene from the most popular JRPG, probably on the PlayStation, and that is Sephiroth kills Aerith in Final Fantasy VII. Once again, that's one of those moments that happen in gaming, and this was early internet, so the internet didn't spread like wildfire like it does now, but just so many people talking about it with no regards to spoilers. Like, once you found that out, or not found that out, once you got to that scene in Final Fantasy, you were talking about it with everybody. Now, luckily for me and my friends were all playing it upon release when it first came out, and just kind of playing it side by side, so we all kind of got there at about the same spot. So luckily there was no spoilers in there for us, kind of thing. No one spoiled it for everybody. It was like, oh my god, did you do it? But yeah, that's one of those moments in gaming that, like a lot of the things on this list, but especially this one, a lot of people still talk about today. Like, I haven't finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth yet, so I don't know, and I know things are playing out differently in the remakes as opposed to what happened in the original game. So I don't know if, Aerith bites it in this one. I've been avoiding spoilers like mad for it, just for all those different things that could happen. So I don't want it to be like spoiled for me in a sense. But yeah, it's kind of like that moment people are waiting for it to happen in the remakes. They're like, oh, how's this going to happen? Or is it going to be different? Are they not going to kill her off? And I will say one thing that did ruin this moment for me afterwards. It's kind of like when you're in a JRPG and someone gets killed and you have a Phoenix down and you can bring them back. I'm just like, I've got a shit ton of Phoenix downs. Can't I just bring her back? And of course, no, because it's a story plot point. It's one of those turn your brain off kind of moments. You don't think about it too hard. You're like, I've revived many downed characters before, but I guess you're knocked out. You're not dead, but if everybody in your party gets knocked out, then maybe you're dead, kind of thing like that. Again, don't think about it too hard. But yeah, that was that moment that not only just everyone was talking about it, like the next day at school, kind of thing like that, but it's still talked about today as one of the most shocking moments in video games. Like, my list is not immune to it, obviously, but so many other top 10 shocking moments, OMG, WTF moments in video games. This one is always in the list, and probably always in like the top 5, top 3. It's a lot of people's number ones. But there's one more moment in video game that I feel, and I could be having my bias because it's one of my favorite gaming series, but I feel there's one other moment in video game history that tops this moment, and it's coming up at number 1 right now. All right, and coming in at number 1, I'm not going to make you wait any longer. The number 1 OMG moment, in my opinion, in video game history is the Psycho Mantis fight in Metal Gear Solid 1. Now, we've had characters break the fourth wall in video games before, but never quite like this. Like, we've had Sonic tapping his foot, looking directly at the player if you just leave him hanging for a few minutes. But with Psycho Mantis not talking to Snake, but talking to you, reading your memory card, especially if you've got Konami games on there, that was just kind of like, what the hell is going on here? It's like, it's all a part of the game, but for a split second, especially if you're a kid or a teenager, your little undeveloped brain there for a second is like, you're really thinking long and hard about that. And then, of course, him being able to read your controller inputs, like if you go left, he knows you're going left. If you go right, he knows you're going right. And you gotta get that little clue from your codex to plug your controller into the second player slot. So yeah, the whole fight in general was amazing and just surreal. But yeah, if you had Konami saves like Symphony of the Night, something like that on your, I want to say Ridge Racer. No, Ridge Racer was Namco, not Konami. But yeah, like just Psycho Mantis reading your memory card off to you. It's just, and it's kind of funny. In the moment, you don't think that it's like, oh, these are Konami games. That's programmed into the game. You're just like, how does the game know to do this, kind of thing like that. It's just, it's just really, really cool to think back. And again, it's something like a lot of games don't do these days, which is why it's kind of stood the test of time, because not too many games have done something like that to really, give you that moment, that just like, whoa, what the hell kind of feeling. And that's just kind of where I think, auteurs like Kojima, because I mean, he's got two things on this list. Square's got two things, but like as far as a personal game maker, he's the only one with two things on this list, and that's just because he did those things. Like, he thought outside the bubble. He wanted to make games more like movies, which kind of Metal Gear Solid was kind of that turning point into more cinematic games kind of thing. But also, he was just thinking outside the box with ways to entertain the player and engage and interact with players. And to me, that's why this fight ranks number one on my OMG moments for video games, just because it does everything. It makes you think about how you're playing the game. Like, you got to plug the controller into the second player slot. It's reading your memory card, so it's making you think. It's interacting with you. Psycho Mantis isn't talking to Snake. He's talking directly to you, the player. And like, I know Kojima would do something similar to that in Metal Gear Solid 2. He'd build off that, where you're in the last few minutes of the game and just stuff starts happening, and your codec's going off and the general's talking directly to you, the player, not talking to Raiden. So just cool things like that Kojima did. But yeah, because that Psycho Mantis fight was the first time he really did that in a video game, that's why it sticks out so much. And that's why, again, much like Sephiroth killing Aerith, it's something people still talk about today. Like, that Psycho Mantis fight, everyone talked about, anybody who had Metal Gear Solid. And I want to say that fight got people to play Metal Gear Solid. Like, whoa, a game does that? I gotta check this out for myself. Like, so it's just, that's why it ranks number one on this list. It's just such a very cool moment in gaming for a cool game. And you're only like, I want to say halfway through the game at that point when this happened. So it's not something you had to wait till the end. It's not something that was at the very beginning. But it hits at the right part of the story. And then, of course, in the lore of Metal Gear, Psycho Mantis becomes a bigger character and does some cooler things in later games. But yeah, no, just the Psycho Mantis fight, just him get into your head and talking to you and things like that. Chef's kiss on that one. Way to go, Kojima. Way to go, Konami, for actually letting Kojima make that game. But yep, so that is the list. Did some of your favorite OMG moments make my list? Did they make the honorable mentions? What are some of your favorite OMG moments in gaming history, whether it's in a game or a game announcement, something of that nature? Please let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, might as well give the video a like. Am I right? Helps us with the algorithm. And as always, I want you to have a great rest of your day, and take care now. Bye.